Our scripture this morning is taken from James chapter 1, verses 1 to 12. Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers and sisters. Excuse me. For you know that we who teach will face stricter judgment. For all of us make many mistakes. Anyone who makes no mistakes in speaking is mature, able to keep the whole body in check with a bridle. If we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we guide their whole bodies. Or look at ships. Though they are so large that it takes strong winds to drive them, they are guided by a very small rudder, wherever the will of the pilot directs. So also the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great exploits. How great a forest is set ablaze by such a small fire. And the tongue is a fire. The tongue is placed among our members as a world of iniquity. It stains the whole body, sets on the cycle of life, and is itself set on by hell, set on fire by hell. For every species of beasts and bird, of reptile and sea creature can be tamed, and has been tamed by the human species. But no one can tame the tongue, a restless evil full of deadly poison. With it, we bless the Lord and Father of us all. With it, we curse people made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth comes a blessing and a curse. My brothers and sisters, this ought not to be so. Does a spring pour forth from the same opening both fresh and brackish water? Can a fig tree, my brothers and sisters, yield olives, or a grapevine figs? No more can salt water yield fresh. Pastor Will, we look forward to your message.
Thanks for that reading, Doreen. But travel is sort of the theme of this, of my summer series of sermons. Some of us get to travel and we get to see family and friends. Some of us have realized that travel is a lot more expensive and a lot more complicated, as Paul was telling us, than we would like it to be. So we might have to stick around. So I thought this summer I would tell stories from different places. And the story from this morning comes from Toronto, which I'll get to a little bit later. I'll be in Toronto just catching a layover later on in August, and hopefully I don't have to deal with any of the problems that we're hearing about on the news. So this passage that Doreen read for us comes from the book of James, a very a difficult passage for us, especially those of us who like to speak, especially for those of us who assert ourselves into positions where we get to and have to speak to other people. It used to be most of us had kept our own thoughts and our own words amongst our own conversations with our friends. And now, somehow, our conversations are going beyond there. It used to be I could guess what my aunts and uncles back in Ontario thought about the political situation in Canada. Now I get to see it on my social media page. It used to be we could sort of assume what other people were thinking. Now everybody gets to broadcast whatever they want. And we like to think that our words are clear, that our political passions, our social justice passions, even our pop culture obsessions, we like to think that, that's perfectly normal and right. We're just doing what other people are doing. But we don't really get to control how other people hear that. And so these words from James talking about how we use our tongues is especially challenging. But there's a stricter challenge here for teachers. And generally the word is translated as teachers. In the King James, it's translated as masters. There are a few examples in the New Testament where people call Jesus teacher. It's the same word. Other stories will call him master or teacher. It's the same word here. So if we are asserting ourselves into positions of teaching, then we're putting ourselves at greater risk. The risk of judgment, and again, the King James uses a stricter word, condemnation. So, what does it mean for teachers and leaders to be exposed to strict judgment or condemnation? So, the judgment word, I wanted to do a little bit of a deep dive into where else we see it. So in the Sermon on the Mount, this is the central text for a lot of us. Jesus speaks there about judgment. And so this is in Matthew chapter 7. We are discouraged from judging, and it says, you will receive the same judgment that you give. It's the same word there in the Sermon on the Mount as it is in James's letter. But then, later on in the book of Mark, it says here that there was a conversation and Jesus is responding to the legal experts, and he says, they are the ones who cheat widows out of their homes, and to show off they say long prayers. They will be judged most harshly. And then in John chapter 9, we see judgment used another way. Jesus said, I have come into the world to exercise judgment, so that those who don't see can see, and those who see will become blind. So we see judgment being used in good ways, in the sense that Jesus gets to judge, and kind of in bad ways, in the sense that these bad legal experts will be punished for their actions. So they should be judged because they're doing bad things. But in some ways it feels like this is kind of a double standard. Jesus gets to judge, but we shouldn't. But even in the Sermon on the Mount text, it says you shouldn't judge, but the reason it says is because the same judgment you use for others will be used against you. That's not really a strict prohibition. It's more of an explanation that when you do this, it will come back to you. There's, in some ways, a little bit of permission. If you exercise a gentle judgment on the world around you, that's okay. You will experience gentle judgment on yourself. If you exercise strict judgment on the world around you, be ready, because you will experience strict judgment. So where do we fit on this? Some of us work really hard to avoid being judgmental. There's an understanding in our world that judging other people's is one of the greatest social sins you can do. So if you have an opinion about someone else's lifestyle, about their romantic life, about their fashion choices, about the way that they spend their money, it's best to keep it to yourself, because being judgmental is about the worst thing that you can be in this world. Jesus says we shouldn't judge, but then he also says that we should expect judgment. So we sort of live in this in-between world. For a lot of the church's history, there's kind of been an understanding among some people that of all of Jesus' teachings, some of them are a little bit extra. Some of them are elevated and really only applicable to the more elevated people. So priests and monks and nuns, those are people who take all of the Bible seriously. They have to live by this. But the rest of the common people, it's a little bit too hard for us. So we'll just kind of leave it for them. And this is, I think, part of that tradition. That the rest of us have to live our lives, but we expect, the monks at least, we expect the nuns, they live in a world without judgment and without violence and anger. The rest of us, we sort of have bills to pay, we've got to take care of things. But within the Mennonite movement, we've been a little bit stricter on ourselves that way. We don't get to say, oh, well, this part isn't for us. Because for us, we say, well, all of this is God-breathed. We have to take the uncomfortable stuff with the good stuff, and so this has to apply to ourselves. But we still don't quite know what to do with it. Sometimes when we read Scripture, Jesus or Paul or whoever the narrator is will speak prescriptively. We like to read these passages and we say, okay, that's what I have to do, that's what I need to do in my life to follow Jesus. But sometimes they speak descriptively or ascriptively. If I were to write a theology book, that would be one of my points, but I'll keep it simple here. Sometimes Jesus is just telling us the way that the world is, and then there's kind of a subtle statement in here, but that's what you're reacting against. Yeah, the world works like that, but you shouldn't. So Jesus is saying, listen, we live in a world of judgment. We live in a world of double standards. We live in a world of injustice, but you shouldn't live that way. You should live by different values. In Scripture, we find other parts that treat leadership seriously, just like this James passage does. So if we go back to the book of 1 Samuel, the people have come to the high priest and said, we want a king. We're tired of this system of priests and judges. We're tired of having to do all the work ourselves of figuring out what's right or wrong. We just want a king, and the king will give us the rules. The king will make our lives easier. And then we can also kind of brag to the other countries that we have this great king. That's what we want. Samuel takes this as a bit of an insult of his leadership, because he's doing a lot of leading. And so he comes to God with this complaint. He says, they've rejected me and my leadership, and I don't know what to do about this. And eventually God says, no, they haven't rejected you and your leadership. They've actually rejected me and my leadership. They've rejected the vision of the world I've given them. They want a different vision. But God says to Samuel, so this is 1 Samuel 8, verse 7. The Lord answered Samuel, comply with the people's requests, everything they ask of you, because they haven't rejected you. No, they've rejected me as king. But then, this is a little bit later on, God says, this is how the king will rule over you. He will take your sons and use them for his chariots and his cavalry and as runners of his chariot. He will use them as commanders of his troops, going on and on. He will take your daughters to be perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He will take your best fields, vineyards, olive groves, and give them to his servants. So God isn't saying, if you install a bad king, he will be greedy. If you install a vain or arrogant king, he will pad his own pockets. No. God is saying, this is what leadership in this world looks like. This is what you want. As long as there are systems of power, people in those systems will use those systems for their own benefit. That's earthly power according to what God told Samuel. But then later on in Matthew, we see a different story. The disciples are together. They're talking about who's going to be on Jesus' left and right. They're talking about who's going to be the new leaders with Jesus. Who gets to be the Secretary of State? Who gets to be the Minister of Finance? Who gets to be the second and third in command? They're excited about leadership. But Jesus knows what it means better than they do, right? They're saying, Jesus, when you come into your power, we want to be there with you. But when Jesus came into his power, he was on the cross. There was someone on his left and someone on his right, but the disciples ran away. They weren't eager to be there. So in this conversation, Jesus challenges them. So this is Matthew 20, verse 25. But Jesus called them over and said, you know that those who rule the Gentiles show off their authority over them, and their high-ranking officials order them around. But that's not the way it will be with you. Whoever wants to be great among you will be your servant. So to lead, to be a leader in the kingdom that Jesus is talking about, means something completely different than leading in the rest of the world, than leading among the Gentiles. So looking at these passages, looking at the overall situation, we're still sort of left with this question, well, okay, but when are we allowed to judge? And when should we suspend judgment? And Canada Day, I think, is a good example of this. Hugo mentioned already in the children's story that when we see these gatherings, sometimes people are happy to celebrate what it means to be Canadian, and some people hang their heads. And just the last few years, we've seen both sides of this. So if you go back to 2021, we had just started unraveling and finding these unmarked graves of children at residential schools. And so for some people, they said, well, we can't celebrate Canada Day if this is what being Canadian means. And so some of them stayed home from the festivities, and some of them tried to reclaim their Canadian identity in different ways. Well, fast forward to this year, and some people have made a lot of noise lately and said, well, we can't celebrate being Canadian if it means living without these freedoms that we want. And so we're going to protest, and we're going to cry for change, and we're going to act up so that we can get that change. And so their celebration of Canadian identity hinges on these things. Are they proud or are they ashamed? Both sides have gotten to say, yes, I'm proud as long as we're moving in this direction, or no, I can't celebrate because I'm too ashamed. And lately, and this is the Toronto part, we've started to hear more stories lately of church leaders who have fallen into suspicion. So there's some overlap here with my story. I'm not going to share details here about that. But as I said before, if you have questions or concerns, I'm still available. In some ways, we understand when politicians become greedy and corrupted. We don't like it. We don't want to keep them around, but we understand. It's sort of what happens. But we hold churches and pastors to a higher standard. We expect them to not be given to greed as easily. We expect them to respect professional and personal boundaries. And so when they do break those rules, then we are extra ashamed. We are extra angry. We exercise extra judgment. So you might have heard a little bit in the States lately. The Southern Baptist Convention is the largest collection of churches in the United States. And amongst those churches, it's been revealed that there is a pattern of people coming to leadership with allegations of bad behavior, and the churches keeping them secret, recording them, but not processing them, telling some people but not the right people, not telling the police and not getting the corrupted people of power out of their positions. And it seemed like maybe this was just one or two, but no, it's been revealed that there were hundreds of people. And the reports have been released and the names have been discovered, and there's anger across the United States about how this could happen. Why are people protecting institutions when they're supposed to be protecting children, when they're supposed to be protecting vulnerable people? And so it's going to be tough for those organizations to maintain respect when that is part of their public legacy. In Toronto, the Meeting House, which is a church that I've visited, it's a church whose pastor has written a lot of books that I've read, who's given lectures, who was part of the master's program that I graduated from. And it's been revealed that he had an inappropriate relationship with one person in his church who came to him for counseling. It's been revealed that other people have fallen into that, and there was a whole system of secrets behind the scenes that leadership there didn't know. I was there, I talked to leaders, and I didn't have any sense of funny business behind the scenes. And he wasn't just a scholar to me. He wasn't just someone who wrote books. I had very personal conversations with him, one-on-one. He heard my complaints, he heard my frustration and my pain, and he gave me good, sound advice. So what do I do now, knowing that this is a person who doesn't live the kind of life that I wanted? This isn't entirely new within the Mennonite world either. There are others, I could list off some names, but I'm sure if we would dig into some of the stories of some of the communities that you've heard of, there would be boundary crossing there too. So in those cases, we would say for sure, we get to exercise judgment there. It's not even us, it's God judging in those situations. And I would say this. In the Bible, it isn't really a rule that we're not supposed to judge. It says in the Sermon on the Mount, don't judge lest ye be judged. Some combination of that. But when you're with children and you see a potential risk, when you see kids pushing boundaries of safe play, and you step in and you give words of advice, those aren't really rules either. Right? If I say to my kids, don't touch the stove, that's not really a rule. That's me stating, if you touch the stove, your fingers will burn. I'm not punishing you by breaking that rule. The rule is punishing you. When we say don't judge, we're sort of talking about the state of the world. So there are times where it's good for us to suspend judgment. We don't know where people are coming from. When somebody's asking for money on the side of the road, we don't know what they're going to do with it. We don't know the path that their life has taken to get them to that point. They might have good uses for that money in mind. They might have bad uses for that money. We're not the ones begging. So it's best for us to suspend judgment over aspects of that story. That doesn't mean you give money recklessly, but we suspend judgment, especially in situations where we don't know what's happening. But in situations where we know the rules, we know the expectations that we have and that people claim to have for themselves, then, yes, we are allowed to judge as long as we understand that we too will be judged. So, the pastor from Toronto that I mentioned, I won't say the name, I exercised judgment on him because he knew the rules. We all knew the rules and he broke them. But more important than my judgment of him, more important than even the judgment of his victims, is God's judgment. Many of you will know people who are critical and judgmental and just seem to have that critique built into their logic systems. I don't have to name names, you know names. We're not all thinking of the same people, that's for sure. Those people carry judgment, not as harshly as they might be judging you, as harshly as they might be judging me or anyone else. They judge themselves that harshly. And they also probably, we have every reason to believe, they understand God to be judging them as harshly or more than they are judging other people. That's a burden they carry with them. But in terms of judging people who harm children, judging people who abuse their positions of power, that's a fair judgment. We know that they will be held to higher levels of judgment because this is what the Bible tells us here in this passage in James. There's a comfort and a challenge in James's words here. We do get to judge others in some situations. We do get to take these rules that guide our lives, that protect us and that protect vulnerable people. We get to hold people accountable to those rules, to those expectations. We get to do that. The challenge there, though, is that we will also be judged harshly if we break serious rules. So there's some of you are probably feeling, well, I don't know if I feel comfortable with you giving everybody else permission to judge. That's not really what I'm wanting you to go home with. A lot of you didn't need me to give you permission anyway. But we get to judge in some cases. But only after we have done the work of understanding the rules, implementing the rules, seeing the value behind the rules, and accepting that we too will be judged by them. So when we judge others, we're sort of taking the place of God. But also when we participate with God, we understand we are creating a safer place where vulnerable people are protected, where kingdom values are lived out. Judgment isn't the best way to do that, but judgment is a natural part of the world. So when we make rules, when we follow rules, when we invest ourselves in systems of accountability, it means that we will get a little extra judgment for ourselves, but it means that we are invested in the work of building that place. So, when you hear stories of leaders who have broken rules, who have broken trust, we know that those leaders will face judgment for what they've done. And as much judgment as we feel rightly or wrongly, the challenge there is to be a part of building something better. So, there are different stories you might be thinking of. We're probably not all thinking of the same ones. Some of them are cut and dried. Some of them are relatively complex. We can't always stop ourselves from judging others. We can't always stop other people from judging us. But what we can do is invest ourselves into the work of making a better world for ourselves, for the vulnerable people near us, and for the systems that we participate in. So thanks, I want to say to those who weren't there at the meeting on Wednesday, thank you for being patient as we went through the investigation process. Thanks for the trust that you showed. And again, if you have any questions about any of this, feel free to come talk to me. Thank you.